You have seen and heard recently an increase in gun violence in major cities around Canada, especially in Toronto. That city's Mayor, John Tory, is calling for an outright ban on handguns. The federal Liberals are now seriously examining the possibility of doing just that and banning assault rifles. Joining me now from Vancouver is Rod Giltaca, Executive Director of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. Welcome to BCN, Rod.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
Now, Rod, people are tired of gun violence, so the reaction is understandable. But would a ban on handguns actually reduce violent gun crime?
Well, first of all, gun owners are tired of violence too, because gun owners are just everyday Canadians, and I'm sick of it myself. But the proposed handgun ban would have no effect on criminal behavior, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But probably the easiest one to understand and the most compelling is that handguns right now are already essentially banned. You cannot possess a handgun in Canada without a license, and to do so, let's say you got a hold of a handgun and you committed some crime with it. Just the fact that you're in unauthorized possession and committed a crime with that handgun, you'd be looking at decades in jail under our current system. But yet I don't see a lot of people that are committing those kinds of crimes getting decades. So no, the ban's not going to work, and they're already banned. And besides, what is an assault rifle? You have a government that hasn't even defined what that is yet, but are talking about a ban. So that's a very strange way to behave in any case.
Now, people seemed really concerned that criminals will steal handguns from the homes of gun owners or from gun stores and then use them for crime. Is that a legitimate concern?
Well, I think it's a concern. So it's this whole side of the topic is actually quite interesting, because you had Mark Saunders, who's the Chief of Police of Toronto, you had Ralph Goodale, who's the Minister of Public Safety, and you had Bill Blair, all talking about how there's this dramatic surge in domestically sourced firearms used in crimes, so-called crime guns. And then we find out that the whole time they had numbers through, via ATIP requests from a fellow named Dennis Young, ex-RCMP officer himself, requested all this information, actually got back the real truth. So in the case of the Toronto City Police, they have numbers on what they've been able to trace back as so-called crime guns, and it wasn't 50 or 60%, and there wasn't a surge. In fact, it's at the lowest point it's been in 4 years. It's been in decline, domestically sourced firearms, and they had reported in their own numbers that it was 9%. But actually, it gets just a little bit better. 9% includes toy guns, replicas, air pistols, all these things starter pistols too, all these things that aren't firearms. So the real problem that I have with that personally is, just as a regular Canadian, is I cannot have people lying to me to justify legislation. That I feel sometimes like I'm the only person that finds that behavior unacceptable. But yeah, not good for any Canadians.
Now, Rod, you talked about assault rifles earlier. The AR-15 comes to mind. What's the big difference then between the AR-15 and, let's say, a hunting rifle?
Well, this is the big problem, and this is the bone that a lot of gun owners have to pick with people that don't know anything about firearms, but yet want to comment on what good firearm reform would be. They don't know what the existing rules are, but they want more. That much they know. But the AR-15 is no different than any other semi-automatic rifle, whether it's a Browning bar that you would use to go hunting, or any semi-auto. They're cosmetically different. It's like putting a spoiler on a car and calling it a race car, on a Honda Civic, let's say. So part of our problem, part of our struggle, is to educate non-gun owning Canadians in what actually makes a dangerous firearm or a firearm less dangerous. So the AR-15, if you were to ban that or even to vilify it, it's not going to do anything for public safety, and we all want a safer Canada. So.
Okay, let's chat a little bit more about Bill C-71. Now, one thing that would change is the way background checks are done. Instead of only going back 5 years, the applicant would have their entire life history, look for past crimes, violence, and mental illness. A lot of people would see that as due diligence. What are your thoughts?
Well, again, the devil's in the details here. When you apply for a firearms license, your entire life history is taken in consideration. I think what people are referring to is on the form, like the application itself is self-reported, meaning that you're filling out the application with the answers that you decide you're going to disclose. And a lot of those questions say, in the last 5 years, have you? And then, of course, the question. And the issue that we have with taking someone's entire life into consideration is, I think, anyone that's in their 40s would freely admit that they're a lot different person than they were when they were 19.
That's true.
And especially veterans. And let's say, and here's another way to consider it. We spent the last 20 years, not me personally, but a lot of people in our society, trying to remove the stigma from people that have had anxiety attacks or any kind of other event that would be considered mental illness. And we don't want to, prejudice these people. And yes, they can be cured and all the rest of that stuff. Well, now we're saying, no, that doesn't matter. We're going to now come backwards and start discriminating against you for, something that might have happened 20, 30 years ago. And we just don't think that that's fair.
I'm glad you brought that up, Rod. What do you do with somebody that, let's say, does have mental health issues, maybe going through a nasty divorce? They're already a gun owner. So how do you protect yourself in society from those people who are going through those issues?
Well, there is no easy answer, right? And that's why we're trying to have an open, honest dialogue about this topic and not just have these farcical public, quote unquote, consultations that they're having where they line up a panel of anti-gun folks and then they just tell you what they think, and these are public consultations. So how is that going to be implemented? That's the real question. So it's not that we're against background checks. The CCFR as a group, we actually are okay with licensing if it's done the proper way. So we're all in for that. We don't want bad people getting guns either, but it has to be done the right way, and that's our big fear about this part of C-71.
So, Rod, some argue that Bill C-71 is a return to the long gun registry. Gun businesses will be required to keep sales records on firearms and purchasers for at least 20 years, although it'll be apparently only be made available to police if they get a warrant.
Well, again, details are important. And this is kind of a red herring that's been floated out there, that when we say that the Bill C-71 brings back 2/3 of a gun registry, and then they say, well, vendors have been keeping this information, themselves, not having to be legislated into it. That's not the part we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that I can't transfer a non-restricted firearm to another license holder without both of us calling in, getting a reference number, that information all being recorded, and then we get an approval. And the problem with that is to have a gun registry, you need the participants in the transfer, you need the place and time, and then you need the information on the firearm. The only piece that's missing is the information on the firearm. And the reason why that's an issue is we go through a lot of things to become firearm owners. And for a farmer to sell his son, or give his son a shotgun, let's say, to control pests on the farm, if they don't do that process right, it's a criminal offense. And we're saying, well, yeah, we'll be licensed. Yes, we'll get a record check every day, which you run through CPIC every day if you're a license holder. That should be sufficient that license holders can move firearms back and forth. We're vetted and monitored worse than any other citizen in the country. So we think that that's sufficient.
So is that a big concern for you as well, then, that there's too much red tape surrounding target shooters, hunters, and farmers?
There's an enormous amount of red tape and an enormous amount of legal exposure. So I'll give you an example. I would be, if I was going to and from the range and I forgot my paperwork, let's say, it's a criminal offense. And that's the issue. Or if I forgot to put a lock on my gun, it's not that I'm subject to some kind of regulatory penalty or let's say civil remedies if somebody got hurt. They're criminal offenses for paperwork and administrative errors. And there are 400 paperwork and administrative errors that result in criminal charges in Canada every year on average. And we don't think that it's going to result in increased public safety or decreased activity for gangs. And that's what we're trying to stop.
And some say the finances required to put this bill into practice would be better spent on policing and social services.
Well, isn't that the truth, right? I mean, when we looked at the long gun registry the first time, the long gun registry was never shown to save a single life. And one of the defenses for keeping the long gun registry was, it's consulted, 20,000 times a day. That was done electronically. Whenever someone got pulled over in Canada, that triggered a search. So it wasn't people looking for criminals or looking for bad behavior. It was done electronically. Now that system that was supposed to cost a few $1 million ended up costing over $2 billion at the time. And that's a tremendous waste of resources. So wouldn't it be better if the firearms program was better staffed so that when someone was applying for a license and they had to have interviews, that somebody actually did those interviews, somebody called those references? A lot of that stuff isn't happening now, and that's a real way to increase public safety.
Now, current gun regulations limit the size of ammunition clips to 5 rounds for a rifle and I believe 10 for a handgun. Does this really increase safety, or is it again maybe another hindrance for law-abiding gun owners?
So that's an excellent example of bad regulation. So I'll give you, as macabre as it may seem, I'll give you an example. So let's say I've lost my mind and I've decided I'm going to perpetrate a multiple victim public shooting. I I'm going to take my magazines, I'm going to get rid of the rivets, I'm going to fully load them, and what? I'm going to go to the scene of the crime, and I'm going to turn off my car, ready to do the deed, and then I'm going to say, oh, wait a second, I may face a firearm charge for these overcapacity magazines. You know what? I'm not going to do this. I mean, of course, it's ridiculous. And so it's very easy for me to demonstrate that there's no benefit to public safety for magazine size restrictions. Who uses 5-round magazines? Me at the range. I'm the only person that's using that. Gangsters, they don't even know that there's a restriction on the sizes of magazines.
Right.
But on the other side of it, if a rivet were to come out of my magazine, that becomes a prohibited device instantly. And some other prohibited devices you may be aware of: hand grenades, landmines, pipe bombs. And it's a 1-year mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison, up to 10 years, depending on the circumstances of the offense. So no upside and big downside for gun owners.
I understand your organization believes the Canadians should have the right to be licensed to carry a handgun if they're properly trained. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, it's the second time I've been asked about that today for some reason. We do have a policy on our website because as an organization, we make our policies completely overt. Now, that doesn't mean that we're actively advocating for concealed carry, because right now we're not dedicating any resources to that. But we do have a policy that says that Canadians should have the ability to concealed carry if they're licensed and they meet some kind of criteria. So it's one of those topics where someone says, well, you think that people should be walking around with guns? Well, we have people walking around with guns already. They're called police, right? So why do we allow police to do it? Because they've met a certain criteria, a certain standard, certain screening, certain proficiency. So we're saying that should be available to Canadians, and sometime in the future. We're not there yet, but that should be available should Canadians meet some standard. And we're not saying no. We're not saying that that people, if you're above 19 years old, you should be able to strap on a gun and start walking around downtown. That's not our position at all.
You know what's interesting is I have a friend of mine down in Phoenix, Arizona, was walking to Walmart, and he open carry had his gun, his sidearm. And he says, check this out, I'm going to Walmart with my gun. Could you ever see that day coming to Canada eventually with open carry?
If I'm going to be totally honest, just as a regular Canadian, it's hard for me to envision a Canada where everyday citizens will ever have the right to conceal carry. And I don't want to be a pessimist on the side of the gun owners, but we're a long way from that. Right now, we're arguing about whether somebody should have to get permission from the RCMP to take their gun to the gunsmith to have it serviced. That's where we are in this debate. And when there's so much going on, like gang shootings and all of this awful criminal activity, and that has surged for sure, we're fighting about paperwork for people that hold a firearms license. So I want to get back to the real discussion, which is the safety of Canadians.
Rod Giltacki, Executive Director of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. Thanks a lot for joining me today via Skype from Vancouver.
It's my pleasure, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.